Ever wondered what Jesus really looked like?
Yeah.
Not just the typical European depiction we often see, but like, what if we actually looked at historical evidence?
Hmm. It's a question that can lead to some really interesting conversations, for sure.
Right. And maybe some complicated ones too, which is why we're doing a deep dive today.
Okay, sounds good.
So we're looking at this academic article today. It's called The Race of Jesus, the Theotokos, Their Depictions, and Why It Matters. But just to be clear, up front, we're not trying to validate any like racial superiority claims or anything like that with this.
Gotcha.
It's more about exploring what history and religious tradition can actually tell us about, Jesus's ethnicity and why that even matters in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for clarity, the Theotokos, it's a Greek title. It means God-bearer, most often used when talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Right.
So the article, it's exploring how they're both depicted.
Okay, cool. Thanks for clarifying that. So one of the things that jumped out at me at the beginning of this article is this statement that Jesus wasn't Jewish, as we might typically, understand it today. They make this distinction between Hebrew and Jew. And I feel like that's really important, but I'm not sure I totally get the significance.
Yeah, that's a key point. And the article really digs into like the whole historical development of those terms, which can get a little complex. But basically, Jew, how we use it today, it's really tied to rabbinic Judaism, which didn't even come about until after Jesus's time.
Okay, so understanding Jesus as Hebrew, not Jewish, it's like it unlocks a different understanding of who he was and like even the world he lived in.
Yeah, exactly. It's about placing him in his actual historical context
Yeah,
instead of viewing him through, this more modern lens that we might have.
gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Then the article goes on to argue that for Jesus to have fully embraced human nature, he must have had a race. And they even compare denying his race to denying his like biological sex. And that's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And it gets at, this big theological idea, the incarnation, the idea that God actually became human in Jesus. And if we accept that, then we have to accept that Jesus, he had a specific ethnicity, a specific appearance, right? It was all part of being fully human.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And that leads to something else I found interesting. The article kind of challenges this common assumption that the Middle East has always been predominantly Arab. They talk about how diverse the region actually was, like way back before the rise of Islam.
Oh, absolutely. The article, it lists all these different groups that were living in the region at the time.
Yeah.
Let's see, like Canaanites, Persians, Babylonians, you have the Hittites, Assyrians, Moabites, and Egyptians, Greeks, Israelites.
Wow, that's quite the mix.
Yeah, it paints a much more complex picture of the region than what we usually imagine, right?
No, for sure. So if we're just thinking about where Jesus lived and assuming he was Arab because of, how the region looks today, that wouldn't be accurate.
Right, exactly, because the demographics, they've shifted so much over time, largely due to the Arab expansion, and then the cultural assimilation that happened after that.
Okay, so then what does that tell us about what Jesus might have actually looked like if we're not just going off of today's demographics?
Well, the article suggests that if we look at contemporary Levantine populations, as a kind of visual reference for what people in that region might have looked like before Islam, it seems likely that Jesus would have had fairer skin, maybe an olive complexion, which is pretty interesting because it lines up with some early Christian descriptions of Jesus and even the Shroud of Turin, if you believe that.
Huh. Okay, so we're starting to get like a more historically grounded picture here.
We are.
But then the article, it doesn't stop there. It actually argues against like depicting Jesus and Mary to match the race of whoever the intended audience is. Why is that so important?
It's because of the theological significance of iconography, in Christianity. Because it's not just art, right? It's supposed to be a visual representation of like actual theological truths. And historically, even across different cultures, early Christian and Orthodox iconography, it was actually pretty consistent in how they depicted Jesus's appearance.
So the early Christians, they believed that how Jesus actually looked, it really mattered.
Yeah, that seems to be the message. And the article even criticizes like Western art for deviating from that tradition.
Yeah.
For portraying Jesus with more European features.
So are they saying like any attempt to adapt his image is wrong, even if it's, well-intentioned? What about like trying to make him more relatable to a certain culture?
It definitely raises questions about where, that adaptation ends and where you might be distorting religious tradition, even if you don't mean to. They actually give this example of how St. Joseph, he's often shown as this young man.
Yeah, that's true.
But historically, he was probably a lot older. maybe even already dead by the time of the crucifixion.
Wow, so even small details like that, they can really change how we see these people and their relationships, right?
Exactly. And it kind of highlights how there can be consequences, even if they're unintended, if you
Mm.
stray too far from what the established tradition actually says.
Yeah, that's a good point. But the article, it goes beyond just physical appearance, too, right? It gets into this whole idea of uh, the dangers of trying to own Jesus.
hmm
What do they mean by that?
They're talking about when certain groups, whether it's racial, religious, or even cultural, they try to claim Jesus exclusively for themselves. They give examples of Buddhists, even some Japanese people, and some Muslims even. And it gets really interesting because it raises these questions about how, different groups throughout history have interpreted and related to Jesus.
Yeah, I see that. And it kind of goes back to the idea that Jesus's message, it's supposed to be universal, right?
Yeah.
So trying to limit him to just one specific group, it almost contradicts that.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how we understand and represent faith, in our world today, which is, well, it's getting more and more diverse,
Hmm.
but we're only scratching the surface here. There's still a lot more to unpack from this article.
I'm definitely ready to keep going. This is already making me think.
So before we went to that little break, we were talking about how some groups have tried to almost like claim Jesus as their own, right?
Yeah, and it was interesting how the article called that, like trying to change Jesus's race in pictures and stuff, they called it a heretical lie, which is pretty
Yeah,
intense.
that's some strong language for sure. But remember, they see those pictures, the iconography, as more than just art, right? Like it's meant to actually depict theological truth.
Oh, I see. So, like, changing his image isn't just an aesthetic choice. It could be messing with, like, core
If
beliefs.
that's his argument, yeah.
Yeah.
And they say this is true even if you have good intentions, like trying to make Jesus more relatable to a specific culture or whatever. They even say that people who change his race in those depictions deny the reality of the incarnation.
Whoa, okay. That's a lot to think about. Can you explain that a little more? I'm not sure I totally follow.
Sure. So the incarnation, remember we touched on that earlier, it's a belief that God actually became human, like fully human in Jesus. So if we accept that, then we have to accept that he had a specific ethnicity, a specific appearance, all part of being fully human. To
Hmm.
change that is to, in a way, deny that essential humanness of Jesus.
Okay, that makes sense. But haven't there always been different artistic interpretations of Jesus, like, throughout history? How does the article address that?
Well, it acknowledges that, yeah, there are different interpretations out there,
Yeah.
especially they point out in Western art. Like Western depictions of Jesus, they've often leaned towards, a more European look.
Yeah.
And they say that's influenced how people all over the world picture him.
So it's not just about modern attempts to make Jesus more diverse. It's like a much
Um,
older issue.
Exactly. Yeah. And the article argues that this, like Western deviation, it's actually strayed from this older, more consistent tradition. The one we talked about before in early Christian and Orthodox iconography.
Right, right. How those early depictions, they were pretty consistent in how they showed Jesus, even across different cultures.
Yeah. And to really hit that point home, they bring up this interesting example, Ethiopian icons.
Yeah.
Ethiopia, it's a culture that's geographically and historically removed from the Middle East. But even in their icons, Jesus is still depicted with features that are consistent with his Hebrew heritage.
So they're saying basically if those early Christians who were like separated by huge distances in different cultures, if they didn't feel the need to like adapt Jesus's image, why should we?
That's their line of reasoning, yeah. They're basically saying that this idea that Jesus needs to look like us to be relatable, it actually reflects kind of a self-centered view,
Hmm.
instead of actually focusing on who Jesus really was.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty powerful challenge to how we usually think about religious imagery.
For sure. And it leads into another interesting point they make about the consistency of apparitions.
Apparitions. Wait, you mean like when people claim to have seen Jesus?
Exactly. So the article argues that, in early church accounts and within the Orthodox tradition, when Jesus, Mary, or the saints appear to people, they're consistently described as having their original historical appearances.
So like no shape-shifting Jesus to match whoever he's appearing to.
Right. And they suggest that changing appearance, that would actually be more characteristic of, something demonic, not holy.
Wow, that's a pretty stark contrast.
And it further reinforces that whole idea that like truth and authenticity, they're super important in how we depict these holy figures.
Okay, so we've talked about how even well-intentioned attempts to like adapt Jesus's image to be more relatable can be a problem. But what about other aspects of religious imagery? Does the article touch on that at all?
They do. They bring up the example of St. Joseph. He's often portrayed as a young man.
Yeah, like super young.
Right. But historically, he was probably much older. Maybe even, deceased by the time of the crucifixion.
Oh, wow. So even seemingly small deviations from, like, historical accuracy, they can have ripple effects, like on how we understand these figures and their relationship.
Exactly. And the article, it ties this back to a broader point about, the importance of sticking to established religious tradition, even in those little details, the ones that seem small. And to illustrate this, they actually make this pretty pointed comparison.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What's the comparison?
They bring up traditionalist Catholics who were really critical of the changes that happened after the Second Vatican Council. So these Catholics, they argue that even small alterations to the liturgy, the way they do Mass and stuff, they say it had this huge impact on how people experience and understand their faith.
That's so interesting how they're connecting these seemingly different issues, like the depictions of Jesus and then liturgical practices. But it's all to highlight how there can be consequences when we stray from tradition.
Exactly. And it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. So where does all of this leave us?
Well, it seems like the article is making a pretty strong case for, authenticity and fidelity to tradition when it comes to religious imagery.
But doesn't that raise questions about, artistic freedom and cultural expression? How do we balance those things with this need to stay true to tradition?
Oh, absolutely. Those are totally valid questions. And those are the kinds of questions that, we need to be grappling with as we try to understand and represent our faith, especially in a world that's so diverse and always changing. And the good news is the article, it doesn't shy away from wrestling with that tension.
Wow. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground here. We looked at the historical context of, what Jesus probably looked like. We talked about how important authenticity is in religious imagery. And we even got into those attempts to claim Jesus for certain groups, which gets kind of tricky.
It does.
But I keep thinking about that tension we were talking about. How do you make Jesus relatable without maybe distorting the truth?
Yeah. It's a tough one, a delicate balance for sure. And the article actually uses a very specific example to, illustrate that point. They talk about how we often depict Christ as a lamb.
Oh, yeah, that's everywhere in Christian symbolism. The connection to the Old Testament Passover lamb and then, Jesus' sacrifice, the whole thing.
Right, exactly. But the article, even with such a powerful image, one that's so rich theologically, they still caution against focusing too much on symbolic representations, even the beautiful ones.
Huh. Why is that?
They suggest that it could actually lead us away from, the real historical Jesus, the God-man who, walked the earth, not just a symbol.
So it's appreciate the symbolism, but don't lose sight of the actual person behind it.
Exactly. It all comes back to their main point. How we see and portray these holy figures, it directly impacts how we understand God and, our faith.
It's not just about getting the facts straight. It's about how those facts shape our relationship with the divine.
Exactly. And to really bring it all home, the article ends with this really powerful thought. The world has nothing to offer us as we possess the totality of the truth in Christ. As such, there is nothing to be gained in appealing to the world, and even attempting to do so is a denial of the truth not only the martyrs died for, but Christ himself.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot to unpack right there. Sounds like they're calling us to stand firm in the truth as we understand it, based on tradition and scripture and all that. It's a pretty bold statement.
It is bold. It definitely challenges us to really think about how we approach all this religious imagery. And the responsibility comes with, portraying these holy figures.
Yeah, no kidding. This whole deep dive has been really thought-provoking, I gotta say. We explored some pretty complex stuff, even some sensitive issues, like Jesus' ethnicity, the whole debate about authentic religious imagery, and whether it's okay to adapt his image or even try to claim him for certain groups. So what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners if they could only remember one thing?
That's a good question. I think the most crucial point is remembering that these discussions, they go way beyond just historical accuracy or artistic preferences. We're really talking about how we understand and relate to, the core of our faith.
It's a good reminder to approach all of this with humility and a willingness to learn, and definitely a deep respect for, the traditions that have shaped our beliefs for so long.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to everyone listening out there, as you come across, different images of Jesus, different interpretations of his life and his teachings, I hope this deep dive encourages you to, ask questions, think critically, and really engage with these ideas in a way that helps you deepen your own understanding of faith.
Well said. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for guiding us through all of this. It's complicated stuff. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.